Note to listeners, this episode was recorded in March 2020, just after the coronavirus was recognised as a pandemic by the World Health Organization on 11th of March 2020, but before most countries had begun lockdown. In this episode, I speak to Yonason Goldson about the price of our personal ethical choices. We also discuss why it's a fallacy that you have to choose between good and being successful. The danger of tribalism and identity politics was also discussed, and Yonason reminded us of Albus Dumbledore's words. It takes a lot of courage to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends. We must remember it's one thing to be a member of a community, but it's something else entirely to sacrifice one's identity and intellectual independence and integrity. That's the belief of socialized mavericks everywhere. Ethics is a struggle, one right versus another right, or one wrong versus another wrong. Being ethical doesn't mean making the right choices each time. It's grappling with ethical dilemmas each time. The more we grapple with our moral compass, the more we strengthen our ethical muscles. And a culture of ethics in business ensures more loyal customers. Listen to the rest of the conversation. Before we begin our conversation, here is a quick shout out to the pathologically curious. Check out the Maverick Paradox magazine. It's a digital magazine written by Mavericks for business owners and professionals. You can find the magazine at themaverickparadox.com. The magazine's aim is to provoke Maverick leadership everywhere. Welcome to the Maverick Paradox podcast, where we explore what it is to be a maverick and discover effective modes of leadership. I am Judith Germain, and my mission is to propel the maverick mindset into a world where character and integrity will ultimately have a higher premium than personality and bureaucracy. So thank you for joining me on this journey. If you would like to continue with me, then please subscribe to my podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or one of the other popular podcast platforms. And today, our guest is Yonason Goldson. How are you?
I am fine, Judith. Good to be with you.
And good to have you. Before we start our conversation, tell us about you.
Oh, my goodness. Everybody's favorite topic, right? I studied English at the University of California and graduated with an English degree, and then did the only thing that seemed to make any kind of reasonable sense. I went hitchhiking across the United States. And then I crossed the Atlantic. I went backpacking across Europe until I ended up in Israel. And that's where I reconnected with my Jewish roots. I'd been raised with really no knowledge whatsoever what it meant to be Jewish, and discovered a whole different way of looking at the world, a whole different understanding of my own identity and my purpose in the world. Ended up living in Israel for 9 years. Met my wife there. We had our first 2 children there. And then we left. We went to Budapest, Hungary for a year to teach high school. We went for 2 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and then we moved to St. Louis, where I've been for the last 23, 24 years. I taught in a Jewish high school here for 20 years until my school closed. And then I wanted to take my speaking experience. I wanted to do something with the wisdom that I had studied for so many years and taught for so many years, and try and present it in a new way to a new audience. And so I tried to distill all of the 3,000 years of wisdom into a single soundbite, and I came up with ethics. Which I think is something that is in increasingly short supply.
Yeah.
We all know we need it, but we're not always quite sure how to go about that. And so now I'm a keynote speaker, addressing business people about how good ethics is good business, the benefits of intellectual diversity, and really what I think we're going to be talking about today, why we don't have to choose between being good and being successful.
All of that sounds absolutely amazing.
Well, the thing about these sorts of stories is when you're going through them, it doesn't seem that extraordinary. And you look back and you go, wow, it's kind of cool.
I'm curious. You said that when you went to Israel, you discovered your purpose in the world. What is your purpose?
Well, to be very general,
Hmm.
um, I think the purpose every one of us shares. Each of us wants to use his or her unique talents, unique abilities, unique opportunities, and unique resources to make ourselves into the best possible version of ourselves, to discover and pursue the unique purpose for which each of us was created. And by doing that, to contribute to making the world a better place. And growing up, going to college in California, which was California is an interesting place. It's slightly west of the United States. You might have heard of it. Um, and there are all sorts of different lifestyles and attitudes there. But I was fortunate in college to be involved with a group of people who were very sincere. I worked for a peer counseling organization, and the students who worked there were very sincere, very committed, very much of that mind. We want to give as much as we take, or more than we take. We want to leave the world a better place than we found it. We want to help people we can while we're helping ourselves. And we had this idea, all of us, we shared this idea that we wanted to contribute to the world and make an impact in a positive way, but we didn't really know how to go about doing it. And when I got to Israel, what I discovered is that there's a whole philosophical and theological discipline that guides us in how to actually conduct our lives, how to structure our lives, how to have a sense of focus and purpose and direction and commitment. And learning that over many years, I'm still learning it. We should all be learning through the course of our lives and trying to apply that and trying to influence those around me in a positive way.
Well, there's nothing to argue against that.
Well, the theory is easy. The putting it into practice is a lot more complicated.
I talk about socialized Mavericks wanting to work for the greater good. And I'm certainly on a mission to help people do that and to, I don't know, make it sort of like help people understand why everyone should be Maverick leaders and why everyone should be working towards the greater good with honesty and a sense of justice. So it doesn't shock me that you're doing something similar, but it shocks me that not everyone is doing something similar.
Well, it's complicated. It's very dangerous, especially these days.
Yeah.
When there is so much tribalism, intellectual and ideological tribalism in the world, and identity politics. If I don't go along with my group, I mean, I'm excommunicated, and I may not have anywhere else to go. I may not have anywhere else to accept me. It's a dangerous business to. I was speaking to a group of high school students recently, and I quoted Albus Dumbledore, who says it takes a lot of courage to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends.
Yeah.
And when you talk about being a maverick, it's something that I relate to very well, because I guess maybe I got it from my father. I've always had an aversion to cliques. There's just something about slapping a label on myself and then limiting myself within that group, that I can't. I lose my sense of individuality. I lose my sense of freedom of thought. And it's one thing to be a member of a community, but it's something else entirely to sacrifice one's identity and one's intellectual independence and integrity. And that's what I feel that you're talking about when you talk about being a social maverick.
Yeah, it just you sort of saying about sacrificing your independence and your integrity just makes me go cold. Like, why would anybody want to do that? When I'm talking to people, I also do speaking. And talk about leadership being about being courageous, and you need courage to be able to stand up and actually say no, and this isn't right, and I won't do this. And I think that a lot of socialized mavericks will lose their job rather than do something that's outside their integrity or against their principle. And I think if more people had that thought process, then businesses would be more ethical.
Yes, and it's certainly it's not a simple matter to put one's what career, well-being, livelihood on the line, especially if there are other people that are counting on me. If I have a spouse, if I have children, if I'm doing good within a certain business or a certain community context, professional context, and the people for whom I'm doing good are going to suffer if I no longer have the opportunity to serve them. But in order to serve them, I have to accommodate certain unethical situations. That itself is an ethical dilemma. I mean, using the greater good as an excuse can compromise one's ethics, but not recognizing the realities of the greater good, it could also be a lapse of ethics. And the line that I always come back to is there's no app for being ethical. I can't just punch it into my phone and it'll tell me what to do. I have to deal with every situation as it comes. And that's complicated.
I sort of made me smile because I'm thinking, I can see us, mankind, programming or setting in motion an AI to tell us what is ethical without thought as to who's deciding what's ethical.
Well, right. I mean, who programs the AI? Right?
I know, it makes me laugh because we've all seen Terminator. We all know Skynet's coming. And we're still gonna plug it in, even though we know.
I have a new book that's supposed to be coming out this summer of ethical dilemmas in certain scenarios. And one of the things I talk about in there is self-driving cars.
Yes.
So on the one hand, self-driving cars apparently, on the whole, are safer than human drivers. But when you end up with those situations where there's a life and death decision, the car can only do what it's programmed to do. So who gets to program the car? And are we not sacrificing some of our humanity when we relinquish the choice over life and death to a machine?
Yeah, because there's that kind of belief that the machine will always choose the right thing, but it's about, as you said, who does the programming.
Exactly.
I was thinking back to what you were saying earlier about the dilemmas between the greater good, because it can be seen in a positive and a negative way, and it made me think about those individuals, because you can have the socialized mavericks that stand up and is always fighting for somebody, but then what I've seen happen is that people then expect that person to be the mouthpiece all the time, regardless of the emotional labor. So it becomes eminently more risky because other people just step back and don't support. So then, whereas you might be the voice of everybody, you become just the voice of yourself, even though you're not necessarily just talking about what you think or what you believe.
That's a really interesting idea. I don't know if I've really given that much thought before, but that goes back to that sort of human predisposition to label and to go with the status quo. Well, Fred or Bonnie, they're the ones who always take the lead. So we'll hang back and we'll let them take the risk. And then we'll see which way.
Yeah, that's not ethical in itself, is it?
No, exactly.
I've been in situations where I've gone, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. just not good, not good for me. And then people say, but we need you to do this. And it's like, well, what are you doing?
Right.
You know, and it's just like, yeah, but you don't seem to mind. And it's like, I don't quite get that.
because you have a backbone, we don't need one.
Well, exactly. I know it's funny. Ethics is one of those funny things, isn't it? Because I think socialized mavericks have a clear idea what's ethical and what's not. But it makes me wonder though, because ethics depend on who's viewing it. Or on one hand, I feel like you'd have to tell me because you're the expert. But on one hand, I feel like something's either right or wrong. But then somebody else will have a different opinion of what's right and wrong. And I was pondering on this, and I was wondering whether Mavericks feel that they are certain that they're being ethical because they know who they are and their principles, and to go beyond that going beyond that makes it not ethical as opposed to an objective standard. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. You tell me. You're the expert.
well, I would say that any person who is convinced that he is ethical should probably do some reflection. The sages say, "Don't trust yourself to the day you die." Mm. And they say it in reference to a particular righteous king in the Second Temple era, about 2,300 years ago, who lived his entire life as an extraordinarily righteous person, until right at the end of his life, he was seduced by a heretical group that steered him down the wrong path, and really, sacrificed much of the good work that he had done his entire life. So I think ethics by definition is a struggle, because it's not always, perhaps even, it's not even often about right and wrong. It's about one right versus another right, or one wrong versus another wrong. Sometimes there just are no good cases. I mean, you are toward good choices. You may be aware that we've had some interesting political figures rising up in the United States the last few years. And the last election, the last presidential election, was between two individuals that were the most unpopular candidates in the history of the country.
Yeah.
And which makes you wonder, how does a system reach the point where we have to choose between two really awful choices? And you had two different types of conversations going on, or really three perhaps. One was, well, this person is so horrible that I'm going to define the other person. I'm going to define candidate A as good because candidate B is so awful. Well, I don't really appreciate the ethics of that. Then you have the situation of, well, candidate A is so awful and candidate B is less awful, so I'll pick candidate B because there really is no other choice. That's a little bit better, but not much. And my choice, which was clearly not the popular one, is I have two candidates that I consider unfit to hold office, and I have a duty to vote, but I'm going to vote third party, not because I like the third party candidate any better, but because it's the only way I can register my protest that I will not be forced to choose between unfit candidates. Now, that puts me in a situation where if I talk about this too publicly, I'm going to get at least half the people in the room mad at me. But I think that it's part of it's an intrinsically unethical system that forces people into a situation where they feel that they have no choice but to choose a candidate that they really can't support. And
Yeah, go on.
That's life. I mean, we have to deal with the situation one way or another. I mean, there's no choice is also a choice. I know people who didn't vote, and I don't agree with that either.
That reminds me of Brewsters Millions, and then people choosing none of the above.
Uh-huh.
And in Brewsters Millions, you have a baseball player that suddenly finds himself really rich because he's got this long lost relative, and he's given a deal. $1 million. This is quite an old, so the money it doesn't quite mean as much. But so he was given $1 million to just take the money and run, or he could have, I think it was $30 million or $300 million, something like that. If he could spend, let's say $300 million, if he could spend $30 million in 30 days, and he had all these kind of things, like he wasn't allowed to have anything left over. He couldn't just gamble it away. He couldn't buy works of arts and destroy it. So he had to be quite innovative. And at one point, he decided that I think it might have been New York, he was going to be the mayor of New York, because he could spend all his money on a political campaign. And his campaign was, and again, they has like two candidates who were really bad, and they were corrupt and evil and all this kind of stuff. So his campaign was none of the above.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then everybody kind of voted for none of the above until they had to start, and then he threw the election at the end, and then they had to re-elect all over again with two new candidates. So it's quite a good film, actually.
Well, yeah, and it's also we have life imitating art, because we just had a New York mayor who tried to spend half $500 million to try to get himself on the ticket, and it's somewhat gratifying. Oh yeah, Mike Bloomberg's mayor of New York, and he literally spent $500 million of his own personal money.
Oh wow!
To try to get the Democratic nomination, and it's a little bit heartening in that so many people were put off by what he was doing, even though in many ways he was a better candidate than many of the other choices. But the idea that someone's going to come in and essentially buy his way into the nomination just left such a bad taste in so many people's mouth. He ended up going nowhere. So it's good to know that there's still a little bit of some ethical sensitivity in the culture.
I see, because in the film, everyone loved the fact that Brewster did use his own money. It's because his campaign was, look, I don't want to take your money. I can just spend my own.
That's interesting.
Well, there you go. That's what happens when it's just the movies and not real life. So one of the things I know that you talk about is that there's a fallacy that you have to choose between being good and being successful. Tell me more about that.
Well, if you look at some really successful companies, I don't know how much of this translates across the pond, but we have a grocery store in America called Trader Joe's. Mm-hmm. And it's relatively new. I mean, I'm sure it's been around for a few decades by now, but it's not one of the old established brands that I grew up with. And people love to shop at Trader Joe's. You walk in and you're happy to be there, and everybody's happy. And it has a lot to do with all the people who are working there. They're all happy.
That sounds so novel.
Yeah, I mean, this is a grocery store. They're not making a lot of money. But there's a culture that the employees feel that they're respected, that they are treated well, that they're to some degree partners in the enterprise. People love to work there. People love to shop there. It's an incredibly successful business. There's a shoe business, a shoe manufacturer called Zappos. Mm-hmm. And there are all kinds of stories about how, some old lady called in and she said there's a problem with her order. And the employees said, well, I'll be right over.
Wow.
Actually went to her house. Now, there was a headline a few weeks ago about a similar situation that happened at a bank. There was an older person who was having trouble with the account, and the teller or the bank, whoever it was at the bank that took the call, asked her supervisor to go over and help this person, got permission, went over, and both the employee and the supervisor got fired by the management for breaking bank protocol.
Oh, okay.
So, on the one hand, you've got companies that have tremendous brand image. They have tremendous customer loyalty because the customers recognize that, yes, the business is there for business. Yeah, who talks about this a lot is Simon Sinek. He's got a new book called The Infinite Game. He says a business has to be more than just a money-making enterprise. It has to have a sense of purpose. And the truth is we all have to have a sense of purpose. And what gives us real joy in life is the sense that I'm fulfilling my purpose. I'm connected to something bigger than myself. I'm part of a team that's worth playing for. I'm part of an enterprise that's worth working for. And when you have that, you have more employee engagement, more loyalty, more passion, more productivity. Everybody wins. You don't have the same kind of turnover. You don't have the same kind of workplace conflict. You look at the statistics of how disengaged and discontented so many employees are today. If you can create a business that has a culture of ethics, a culture of trust, a culture of purpose, then you are going to have an energized and a devoted workforce. And you are going to attract loyal and enthusiastic customers.
The thing is, it seems so self-evident. Do you think we're just greedy? It's just because it doesn't make any sense not to do that unless you are motivated by as much money concentrated in a small number of hands. And
human beings
control.
Yeah. Human beings are in a perpetual battle between short-term gain and long-term gain. It's the nature of who we are. If you're a Freudian, you can plug it into the Freudian model, but you don't need to go there. It's just human nature. What are the two most popular kinds of books, right? You want to make money writing a book, you've got two choices. Write a cookbook or write a diet book. Is that not ironic?
Or if you're Maverick, write both.
There you go. How to cook a dietary food, right? But that just tells us so much about ourselves. The jokes people tell about, I'm really good at quitting smoking. I've done it 1,000 times.
Yeah.
I've been on countless diets. We want immediate gratification. We recognize intellectually that it's not going to be good for us. It's not going to lead to long-term success, but I want it now. And if we don't cultivate the discipline to control that impulse, then it's going to control us. And even if we do control it, there's this psychological phenomenon called licensing. It's the guy who goes to the gym and he works out for an hour, and then on his way home, he stops at the ice cream store and he gets a milkshake with 3,000 calories in it, right? Because, well, I just worked off all those calories in the gym. Okay, so you worked off 1,500 calories and now you're eating 3,000.
That's why going to the gym is so unhealthy.
Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of rationalization. And in my keynote speeches, I talk about the enemies of ethics, and the first one is rationalization. We convince ourselves that what we want is what's right. And then later on, we wonder what was I thinking?
But that's interesting, because I wonder whether ethics move depending on the circumstances or whether they're static. So you could, I don't know, you go to the cash point and someone's just left and there's 50 quid in there because they didn't pick it up. So you could say it's ethical to give the money back because it clearly belongs to the other person. But then that person could justify it to themselves, like they need 50 quid to buy food, so they'll keep the money. And I suppose they could justify that it's ethical to do that because they're responsible for making sure their family doesn't starve. I suppose I'm just trying to.
Well, that's definitely the way the mental mechanism operates. And there is an element of truth in that. And think about, we have a big issue in the court system today, what are called activist judges. And they're not really following what the law says. They're following what their conscience or their sensitivities tell them is right. In fact, and this goes back, over 40 years ago, my mother was on a jury and they were listening to a malpractice case, medical malpractice. And they got into the deliberation room and every single juror agreed that the doctor was not guilty of malpractice. And they still ruled in favor of the defendant because they said the defendant got hurt, they're in bad shape, and the doctor has insurance. So the insurance will cover the doctor. And my mother was the only juror not to vote in favor.
So he never works again, because that's fair.
Well, yeah. I mean, they don't think that far ahead. Because insurance rates go up, and then he passes those insurance rates on to the clients or onto the patients, or he doesn't do a. I mean, there's so much cover your rear end in medicine now. Doctors are calling for tests that they know are not necessary because on the chance something goes wrong and they get sued, they want to be able to show that they have done everything humanly possible. And so the systems get backed up and the prices go up. And this is because someone somewhere decided, well, let's try to be nice to somebody in need. And as well-intentioned as it may have been, that contributes to a whole disintegration of the system. So
is it possible then that you just can't be ethical?
No, it's not. It's absolutely essential to be ethical, but ethical does not mean choosing the right choice every time. Mm-hmm. Ethical means grappling with these type of complicated situations. Because the more we grapple with them, the more we struggle with them, the more we calibrate our moral compass. And that's how, that's how you move the ball down the field. In other words, wherever my ethical challenge is right at the moment, if I'm grappling with the issue, then what I'm doing is I'm strengthening my ethical muscles, which means whether I get it right or wrong this time, I have a better chance of getting it right next time.
Yeah, because I think then, because I'm going back or walking back, as the Americans say, that I think that socialized mavericks are more sure of their ethics because they grapple with ethics all the time in every decision making that they do.
I think that's fair.
Because if you look at socialized mavericks, when they're working stuff out, they look at the whole picture. So they look at a holistic view, they look at all the stakeholders, they look at where would a linear logic take you to the end result. They consider as many outcomes as they can possibly figure, and that would include the human dimension. And it's made, that kind of reasoning is for every decision that's made, whether it's a big decision or a small decision. So by the point that they've got to X period of time in their lives, they would have been practiced, because even in one day, you've probably got 30, 40 ethical decisions have been decided. So it's not like, maybe it's not a case that they are more ethical, but they kind of strengthen that muscle more. So those ethical decisions don't take as long to be made, because when you do say it often enough, you make shortcuts, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I call an ethical mindset. It's not, it goes back to this idea. There's no handbook for being ethical. I can't look up instance by instance. The best I can do is to struggle. And if you want a rule of thumb, It's not 100%. I don't know what the percentages are, but if you want a rule of thumb, the choice that seems the most difficult has a better likelihood of being the one that's right.
Yeah. Because I think one of the common things is people say, "Why do you worry about that? What does it matter?" Or people won't find out, as if that made a difference in the conversation. Like, no one will know. It's like, but I'll know. Oh no, I know you did that. I can't do that. But yeah.
And that argument is becoming less and less viable as we have so much surveillance.
Oh yes, we'll find out.
You never know when somebody's listening or somebody's watching or somebody's recording, and whatever you're doing could end up on YouTube.
Yeah, in a heartbeat. So I agree with what you're saying and Simon Sinek's saying about businesses needing to have a sense of purpose, mainly because Mavericks don't tend to work in places that they can't see that there's a purpose to it. But I also think that these days, more and more individuals require a purpose greater than themselves. Otherwise, they don't want to bother. And I think that with the current situation we are in, with the coronavirus, at the stage that it is, I think people will eventually return to work in some form or another, struggling with those, how did my company treat me? Or how did that company treat me? So at the moment, there's a organisation in the United Kingdom that has said, they're a big organisation. They've said people can come into our doors. It's not a big deal. It's okay. Despite everybody saying social distancing and everything else. Anyway, so the government said now everything's locked down and they can't come. So this organisation said, right, we're not paying our staff. So they're standing out as being one of the biggest organisations that are publicly stating that they're not going to pay their staff any money. And they're such an outlier that there's people on Facebook saying things like, when this is over, I'm never going to go in there again. Whether that turns out to be true or not. But
right.
Because people change them, maybe in 12 months or 12 weeks or 6 months or something, people will change their mind. But the initial reaction seems to be, I will never darken their doors again because of this reaction, which may or may not be the right action for that company. Who's to say?
Right. I mean, you're touching on so many different points. There's a case. It was in New England a number of years ago, where one of the mills there, production mills, they had a fire and the business shut down, and the owner continued to pay his employees while they were under repairs. However, in the end, the business went broke.
Yeah.
You have a constant debate in this country about minimum wage. Right. So if you force employers to pay their employees an extra 20, 30%, so they end up having to fire a certain percentage of their employees. So you've done well by the ones who keep their jobs. They're now making more money. But you've hurt a percentage of people that can no longer support themselves or no longer have an income. There are consequences to every action, and it's not always simple. And also, when it comes to looking at other people, I see a company and I say, well, they're not continuing to pay their employees. Well, maybe they're just greedy, or maybe it just is not viable for them to do that. And unless I know what their circumstance is, I have to be careful before I rush to judgment.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It comes down to judging, isn't it? And how we as individuals tend to judge ourselves based on our personal circumstances and judge others on what we can see without delving into those personal circumstances. Maybe because it's easier, or maybe it's just that you just don't think of it in that way.
Well, we judge based on what we know, and I'm not fond of the term non-judgmentalism, because I think we have to make judgments, but we have to be very careful. Famous saying of the sages is, be deliberate in judgment. They don't say don't judge. They just say make sure you have all the information first, and yeah, that's not always going to be simple.
Yeah, and maybe there's a thing about judging and condemning. So you can make a judgment on something, but that doesn't necessarily mean you need to condemn it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I'm wondering, can you teach ethics if employees don't care about other people?
Well, I think ethics is going to be something that comes from the top down, and it's the owners, it's the managers, it's the executives. They're the ones responsible for setting a company culture, creating a company culture. And once you have a company culture, then you're going to be looking to hire people who show a sensitivity for that culture. So you'll be less likely to be bringing in employees who are not ethical, if that's the culture you want to create. And if you do end up with such an employee, then that becomes part of the criteria that you use in whether or not you keep that employee. Now, it's not just a matter of, oh, we saw you do something unethical, you're fired. It's rather a matter of what you did is not consistent with who we are. And if you would like to stay a member of this organization or this enterprise, then you need to understand who we are and you need to adapt. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to be around very long.
And what happens if it's the top man or woman that's unethical, even if surrounded by, I don't know, a board that is ethical?
Well, then we're back in the that same conversation, aren't we? How much? What's the price of our ethics?
Which in itself is a difficult one.
Yeah, and of course it's not even that simple, because how unethical does a person have to be before he's unethical? I mean, I
think. What I see is people will put up with a lot of rubbish if that person is successful.
Well, of course.
Because like ethics comes at an economic cost, isn't it? So, and we don't need to look at world leaders to answer that question. You can look much closer to home, isn't it? Is that if people can get away with being successful, then a vast majority of the people will accept that regardless of the consequences. It's only when that person gets caught out that people say, hang on, that's really unethical, we shouldn't be doing that.
Oh, we had a major scandal here a number of years ago. It's probably more than a few. A company by the name of Enron.
Yes.
They have heard of it. Interestingly, nobody had heard of it outside the business world when it suddenly collapsed and there's this economic fallout. But in talking about the culture of the company, it was one in which they encouraged a kind of cutthroat culture.
Yeah.
They pitted their executives against one another with the philosophy that people are going to try harder if they know that the others are trying to cut their throats. And it worked for a while, but eventually that just creates a culture that is so toxic, that is so unhealthy, that it's not viable. And that's seen now as having contributed to the downfall of the company.
Yeah, I suppose in the past, I'm not sure it's true now, but I suppose in the past, being able to survive a toxic environment or be that toxic leader was a sort of sign of manhood. Ability to cut it, the ability to be that lone ranger.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, John D. Rockefeller, who created the oil industry in this country, he was a profoundly religious man, and he believed he had a calling from God to serve a higher purpose. and he ended up donating an incredible amount of money to philanthropy. But along the way, he treated his employees terribly.
What you're convincing me is that ethics isn't as obvious as I thought. It's a lot more complicated.
Well, and then that brings us full circle, doesn't it? Because you ask the question, why aren't people more ethical? Why isn't it obvious? It's obvious in theory, it's obvious in principle. But like so many things, as soon as we start to deal with that messy business of details, it's a lot harder, and there's a lot at stake.
But what I think is easier the more you practice it, and more that you don't think of it as ethics. You just think of it as, going about your business, doing, living life, and it would seem the right thing to do to consider the people that you impact.
Yeah, and that really goes back to my my tagline of good ethics is good business.
Uh-huh.
And if we would see it as good business and make that part of our business strategy, then we wouldn't be compartmentalizing so much and sacrificing long-term benefits for short-term gains, which is almost guaranteed to end up getting us to sacrifice our ethics.
Yeah, it made me think there that there's too much of a rush actually to compartmentalize all sorts of things, and it would probably make more sense if people just integrated all that into their being, rather than saying, I don't know, my ethical standard at work will be different to the one I have at home, or vice versa, and my ability to lead will start at home and finish at work, or just say this is it. Look at it. Maybe I'm an emergent thinker. So look at everything. So I'm all very much like, you need to look at everything in the round.
Well, that itself is a whole discussion. Looking at things in terms of their components, and looking at them in a holistic sense. We have to do both.
Exactly.
You have to work through the steps to get to the goal, but if the steps are not coordinated with all the other steps, they're not going to lead us anywhere.
Perfect. Just before we finish, is there anything I should have asked you that you would like to answer? Because here is your opportunity.
Go out and be good.
That I could follow you with that, with a nice banner with that.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that has been very much in my mind lately, I gave a TED talk last summer that was very much to this theme, is we get so caught up in labels, and we label people and we don't get to know them. We don't understand where they're coming from, which makes it easier to brand them as evil or misguided or deluded. If we make the effort to engage people who think differently from us, to understand them rather than debate them, to hear their point of view rather than force ours on them, then I think our communities would be much stronger. And I think that what you said earlier about the Maverick who ends up being expected to take the lead and do the job for everyone else, instead will be someone who's able to bring others along with him. And because there's a sense of community and there's a sense of common purpose, as we talked about. And so broadening our circle, engaging people from different points of view, different perspectives, different belief systems, different parties, different philosophies, it humanizes. It gives us the opportunity to humanize one another. And that's what makes communities thrive, and that's what makes it easier for all of us to be ethical.
That is so cool. I like that, humanizing each other. I've written that down to remind myself at that point. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Would you come back again and speak about something else?
I'd be happy to. This has been delightful.
It's been cool. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you once again for tuning into the Maverick Paradox podcast. I hope you have enjoyed listening to my conversation with Yonason as much as I enjoyed having it. If you are pathologically curious and would love to find out more about the Maverick Paradox, then please subscribe to this podcast on one of the popular podcast platforms. Alternatively, you could explore our resources on Mavericks at maverickparadox.com or read the Maverick Paradox magazine. We publish frequently each week. If you subscribe, you will get our monthly newsletter. And let's not forget my book, The Maverick Paradox, The Secret Power Behind Successful Leaders. For those that love a good discussion, you could apply to join our exclusive Facebook group. And finally, if you would like to work with us or just interested in finding out more about the Maverick at work, check out our website maverickparadox.co.uk.